So, good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Catherine Raven in conversation with David Ulin. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding 40 years ago. And we actually are having a big sale right now across all of our stores for our 40-year anniversary, so drop by. Just a couple of items to note before we get started. I will be using the chat box to provide links for upcoming Copperfields events, details for purchasing tonight's title, as well as a discount code. And as always, we'll include my contact information. And additionally, the format will feature between 30 to 40 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. The Q&A box will be your go-to tonight with any questions or comments. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. Please go ahead and submit questions and comments here. You don't have to wait. You can do it while the talk is going on, and we really appreciate that. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's author, Catherine Raven. Catherine is a former National Park Ranger at Glacier, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Voyageurs, and Yellowstone National Parks. She earned a PhD in biology from Montana State University, holds degrees in zoology and botany from the University of Montana, and is a member of American Mensa and Sigma Xi. Her natural history essays have appeared in American Scientist, Journal of American Mensa, and Montana Magazine. You can find her in Fox's Valley, tugging tumbleweeds from the sloughs. In conversation with Dr. Raven tonight is David Ulin. David is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lenan Foundation, and Black Mountain Institute at the University of Nevada. The former book editor and book critic of the Los Angeles Times, he is an associate professor of English at the University of Southern California, where he edits the literary journal Air and Light. They are with us tonight to discuss Catherine's brand new title, Fox and I, An Uncommon Friendship. And I'm really excited to dive into this one. I know many of you are too. So why don't you go ahead and take it away for us, David?
Thanks so much, Jamie, and welcome to everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Catherine, nice to see you again. And I'm delighted to see you now that the book is actually out. And I guess we should say it's going to be a New York Times bestseller. Is that correct? That's right. Like starting this weekend, right? Straight out of the gate. So that's a pretty great way to start. What we thought we would do, just because the book is literally just out, and many of you were assuming haven't had a chance to read it yet, is to just start with a brief reading, so to give a flavor of the writing and the style. And then when Catherine's done with that, we'll talk for about half an hour or so, and then we will open it up to questions in the Q&A. So Catherine, why don't you kick us off with a taste of the book?
Okie dokie. This is from the chapter Meadowlark, and it is discussing Fox and I doing a little bit of our hunting. Fox had just caught a rabbit, but dropped it as soon as he saw me dancing across the pasture in my cactus-crushing wellies. I had my eyes uphill on the hound across the gravel road. Maybe it was on a leash, or lazy, or mired in quicksand, but that dog never moved from its one spot, a half-mile away, and an unimpeded line of sound and sight to my front door. I sang over Fox's head, Elvis's song about a hound who can't catch a rabbit. Fox pranced a horseshoe pattern back and forth in front of me. Ignoring Fox, I jumped right into the third iteration of my musical complaint, reminding the hound dog that he hadn't ever caught a rabbit and would never be a friend of mine. Fox didn't like being ignored. He snatched up his rabbit, squeezing it in the middle and leaving it sagging from either side of his jaw. It looked like the toothpaste tube my fist had wrapped around that very morning. Bending down until my face was an arm's length from his, I placed a hand on each knee. Fox leaned in. That rascal with the slobbery flews, I whispered, pulling the skin on either side of my mouth and shaking my head to imitate hound flews. He'll never catch a rabbit. Fox dropped his rabbit and said, "Quack." Standing up, I crooned about the dog whining all the time. It was a pitiful rabbit specimen, but I couldn't stop in the middle of the chorus. The sheriff picked up the abandoned dog a few days later. We were not trophy hunters, Fox and I, but we gathered our share of mementos. The Boone and Crockett Club wasn't sending judges over to measure the 4x4 mule deer rack hanging above the sofa between photographs of a grand Teton moose exiting a foggy pond and animal pictographs carved into sandstone. I shot that mule deer in the dawn following a full moon. The night before, I tromped 4 miles along a snow-packed ranch road, listening to my footsteps, scouring for hoof prints, watching a bright orange dome fill the horizon in front of me. The entire horizon, right to left, nothing but moonrise. I could feel Earth's round ball melded under my mucklucks. Of course, a full moon seen along the horizon is the same size as every other moon, so say physicists. The size of the moon glowing before me was an illusion, magic, my mind playing a trick on me. Here's what I learned from that trick. When you are walking alone on the prairie, and unless you're a physicist, how the moon feels, looks, and acts is more important than its approximate size. When Fox scored his big trophy, I saved only 2 feathers. The first thing I recall about that day was watching him through my spotting scope. He was at the far edge of the alfalfa field, a good quarter mile away. Low cloud cover kept the sun from his eyes as he ran a beeline to my cottage without stopping to set down, nibble, or adjust his precious cargo. All the while, he was hustling at a speed that kept me from identifying his prize. He stopped 2 meters away from me, a meadowlark's entwined legs dangling from his jaw. He dropped the lark, walked right past it, and sat as I turned to face him. No one likes a dramatic fox, but I had expected a little more animation for such a huge milestone. "It's a miracle," I told him. Then louder, with arms raised and fist clenched in the victory salute, "A miracle," I repeated. I mean, Fox was talented, but he couldn't fly. I hadn't thought he could take down a robin-sized bird. The spring bluebird carnage I had once accused him of perpetrating had turned out to be the work of kestrels, North America's smallest falcons. At one time, kestrels were hard-working, respectable raptors who earned their living killing insects and hunting little birds. When the valley people lined the roadways with bluebird nest boxes, kestrels went on the dole. Now they eat subsidized bluebirds morning, noon, and night. 2 magpies swooped in and began tearing at Fox's unguarded kill. The twiggy legs and curled knuckles of the abandoned lark reached skyward. I jumped into the fray when more magpies arrived. As is the case with all animals we dislike, there were too many of them, thousands probably. The magpies swirled around me in tightening circles, leaving me in a vortex of yellow feathers. Fox ignored the pilfering magpies in my energetic attempts to scare them off. The magpies retreated to my blue steel roof and lined out, hanging their long toes over the edge and tipping toward me. I brought out a refrigerated raw egg, nesting its white shell in a wreath of blue fescue. "For you," I said to Fox, backing away, maintaining eye contact and trying to ignore the wretched, random cries of the roof-thumping magpies. Okie dokie.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I want to, it's a great passage because it gets at a lot of interesting questions to address about the book. I want to start with this idea, once the magpies come in, well, you've got Fox who's showing off his prize in the first place, or seems to be showing off his prize to the narrator, to you. And then the magpies come in, and you're really talking in some way about a kind of society of animals, about the way that the animals are interacting with one another, as well as the way that you're interacting with the animals. But you're not sentimentalizing nature at all. And I know there's a big conversation in the book about not anthropomorphizing. And so I just want to start with a general overview in terms of trying trying to write about animals as they are and trying to write about animals interacting with one another in the wild, and also you as a human animal interacting with them in the wild. What are the challenges of that? I mean, I know, I understand the kind of sentimentalizing impulse, and I know that you as a scientist want to avoid that. What are the challenges? What are the pratfalls? How did you go about creating that world on the page?
There's a lot of challenges, and I did have to, you mentioned that I was just another animal, and I really had to feel comfortable with myself as another animal. It is easy for me to empathize with animals, but I fit myself into what I consider to be a fellowship in the classic J.R.R. Tolkien Hobbit sense of fellowship as being one of the two types of social structures. So either you have a family that you're born into, or you have a fellowship, which is the group that you make up. And for most animals, that family doesn't really exist except for a little bit of time after birth. And even very soon after birth, it might not exist. So the animals really do live in a fellowship. So I had to get myself in that fellowship mindset, and that wasn't too difficult. What was difficult, trying to balance what I had learned from the Park Service and what I have learned from science, was that separation that I was trying to keep between humans and other animals. And when you look at other animals and you look down on them and think that they don't have a personality, of course, that's a problem. That's the issue of anthropomorphizing. That was the first hurdle to get over, was to get comfortable with the idea that I was doing what maybe is classically considered anthropomorphizing, but that's because I learned after a year with Fox that I don't really accept the basic premise of anthropomorphism, which is that I don't believe we know which traits belong solely to humans. So I was able to see that other animals, some of those, the magpies and the rabbits and the deer and the skunk, I can see how they all fit into this fellowship and their personality. But the second hurdle, that's where we get to the point of me as an animal. The second way that we separate ourselves from animals, the more modern and educated way, and that's just as much of a problem. We separate ourselves because we think we're better than them. And so we have to prevent ourselves from killing any of them or harming any of them. And we have to love them all equally. And I definitely wasn't able to do that. I finally realized that I really am a member of this community. I hunt. I'm not vegan, for example. I'm not holding myself as a human and saying I have these traits that only humans have, the ability to moralize and say, well, it's not moral to kill other animals, because fox and skunk and badger, they don't have that ability to say it's not moral to kill other animals. They just do kill. And also they have enemies. Fox certainly had, he and the vixen certainly were enemies of feral cats after they got a little bit more bold. And before he was an enemy, he was scared to death of the feral cats. And he really wasn't crazy about deer. They're nosy and they just loved being around the fox's den. I'm not sure why, but wherever Fox seemed to sit, the deer just wanted to be sitting in his same spot. And you could see he hated it because he always got up and moved. He just had his likes and dislikes. And so I had to allow myself to have likes and dislikes too. I love having rabbits around here, but that big Roman-nosed rabbit that was eating the roots of my lilac, I did not like that rabbit. And I certainly did not like all the voles. And I had a little bit of a problem with one of those northern pocket gophers. And I didn't like the feral cats either. And I still have a problem with feral cats. So I had to allow myself to be as you said, to be just another animal and not hold myself up above them and try to moralize and prevent myself from killing and having likes and dislikes and things.
It's interesting because there are various points in the book where you kind of, again, not in an anthropomorphized way, but you move into the headspace or the personality or the perspective, let's say, the point of view of fox or of some of the magpies, particularly T-ball. And, you know, and we kind of see the world, or you imagine, I guess, the world, or extrapolate the world through their eyes, through their sensibility. I'm wondering if you can talk about both that as a kind of aesthetic move in terms of deepening and broadening the narrative that you're writing, but also the process of creating them as characters on the page.
Yeah, and one important reason why I show another perspective besides just mine and Fox's was it's because I want people to realize that as a human, it's not just so wonderful that I fit myself into nature. And of course, I want my readers to do that. I want you to fit yourself into nature, but you have to realize that there's not going to be this big welcoming party, that we leave a footprint. That's just the way it is. And I wanted to examine the footprint that I was leaving, even for things like the ant nests, when I created the shade and I wiped out an entire colony of ants. There could have been maybe 30,000 ants in that colony. And I wiped them out, but it was just part of me creating my space. And that created a lot of problems. So there's a domino effect. And I looked at everything from the point of view of the ants, and the magpies really didn't seem to like me. I mean, this house that I have here, it's the first permanent structure, as far as we know, that's ever been on this property. And at that time, there wasn't anything else around for a good mile in any direction. So it was the first structure. There have been people around, but the people had a large home base. So they were moving all the time and not just staying. And of course, Native Americans lived a little bit differently with animals, certainly had a different relationship with magpies than people who grew crops and decided to hate magpies. And then I had a steel roof. That's important because of fire, but the steel roof is probably a little offensive. It catches the light and it makes a glare for them, which they might not like. But those magpies thump on my roof, just banging, banging, banging on the roof for no apparent reason, except I don't know if they're trying to knock the house down or what, but it's not going to work. But I wanted to do things from their point of view to show why I am in their way and how I create this domino effect, and that we have to realize that we do leave a pretty big fingerprint on the land, even when we're just trying to, I kept trying to make friends with the magpies and I couldn't figure out why they were not biting. They just didn't, why they kept stomping on my roof, no matter how nice I thought I was.
You also talk about, I mean, or describe, and I don't want to give too much away, but you know, you do describe, and towards the end of the book, in a very profound way, the relationship of the animals with one another. The magpies, for instance, with fox, or fox and the vixen and the kits, and I wonder too about, you know, obviously part of that has to do with your observation, you know, watching how the animals act with each other, but you are also kind of you know, interpolating some kind of I don't want to quite say an emotional connection between them, but some kind of dynamic, you know, between individual animals. And I'm curious about, kind of both as an observational thing, as you as a scientist kind of observing that out in, you know, out in the world, but also how that becomes a narrative element in this memoir.
There's definitely subplots. So the main plot of the story is the friendship between Fox and I. But this book was structured pretty much like a novel. So there's subplots too. And the subplots, my relationship with T-Ball, the magpie, the main matriarchal magpie, and her mate Torntail, and also Fox's relationship with her, which was very different. I had been assuming, because I just could not get along with those magpies, that Fox wasn't getting along with them either. And when they were hanging out with him, they must be enemies. And then, of course, I end up witnessing something that I see they weren't enemies at all. In fact, they were getting along very well. And it's whether there's emotional tie between them, they certainly were pairs. And Fox hunted also with a young hawk in the when I first met him, he was hunting with that young rough leg hawk too. And so I did notice a lot of relationships that animals have with each other. Now, I'm doing observations every day and oftentimes 4 or 5 hours a day. So it's a lot. By the time I started writing the book, I probably spent more time with the community here, the fellowship of animals, than some married couples do in a 20-year marriage. I'm just guessing, having never been married, but it seems like it's an awful lot of time that I spent with them, observing them.
What that observation, those hours of observation, what that process is like, when you're doing that work, what does that look like?
Usually I'm outside and I'm working with both a spotting scope and binoculars. Sometimes, of course, when I'm with Fox, I'm very, very close to him, but I can some days start watching him when he's further away. And when he leaves me, I'll watch him for a long time further away with spotting scopes and also with binoculars. The other thing that I started to do after using the glass to watch him, I made myself see things from his actual height perspective. So on all fours, getting my head actually down where his head would be and walking through the slough where he walks. That was an interesting experience because I thought that we were kind of in the same world when we were sitting next to each other. Only when we were very close to each other were we really seeing the same world. When he's walking through the grasses, he really can't see very much.
Right.
And I'm surrounded. This is a valley, but it doesn't really look like a valley because of the way the river turns. It looks like it's surrounded by mountains. Instead of just having mountains on two sides, it looks like there's mountains in every direction. So I'm always facing the mountains. But I noticed he likes to see them. He loved boulders. And I suspect the tall grasses was one reason why. And every time he was on the boulders, he never faced into the mountain. He always faced the view. So it's hard for me to believe that he did not have a sense of aesthetics, and that sense of aesthetics is very close to what the typical human sense of aesthetics is. And when we know that humans like water, for example, we know that they like greenery. There are certain scenes that seem to be universal, regardless of what culture you're from. And so if you face the larger mountains, then you're looking at the river. So you can see the big wide river. It's huge during some times of the year. And it's glinting and it turns, and it's a very attractive river. And then the mountains behind it. When he would jump up on the boulders, he was always facing the same view that I like to face, which is odd, I think, to be doing that all the time. So I do think he had a sense of aesthetics. But when he was in the grass, I was shocked at how different his view was than mine.
And you're saying you think he liked the boulders because it took him up above the grass. So he had a broader perspective. He could get a sense of the whole valley, as you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't you think and humans are the same. I mean, we enjoy a view also. We don't like to be closed in all the time where we can't see. And he definitely liked to have a view. And
Yeah,
I also observed what he smelled. And the other thing that I did with my observations was spend a lot of time with sun and heat, because I realized that really determined, he just gerrymandered his little routes around the sun. So I figured out this animal will not walk in. He doesn't want the sun in his eyes. What he needs is sunglasses, actually. But
right.
not having sunglasses, he will not walk into the sun. And there were times when it was difficult because there'd be a feral cat in his way. I know he didn't want to get near the feral cat, but he didn't want to walk with the sun in his eyes. But he likes to soak in the sun as long as I'm watching and making sure the dogs and cats aren't around. So if once my gravel driveway heated up, he liked to get his belly on that gravel driveway and rub on the heat on the warm gravel. So he waited till the heat of the day to get there. He came by at 4:15 because that was right when the sun just tips behind this one hill on the west, and that makes a shade patch in front of my house. And he liked that shade. And he came as soon as that shade showed up, he was there. So he kind of just moved around based on heat and sun as well.
Now, when did you decide, or how, let's talk a little bit about how the book evolved. You know, you were engaged with this, I don't know, I mean, you described it as an uncommon friendship in the subtitle of the book, which I think is a perfect way of describing it. It is a friendship. There's a real relationship between these two animals at the center of the book, the narrator and the fox. Now you're living that experience. At what point did it occur to you that this was a narrative that you might want to tell? How did you begin to kind of conceptualize it as a piece of writing?
I first decided I was going to have to write his story when he showed up one night with his second batch of kits. So it was going into the third year, actually, that I knew him. And he brought them all down to the house around 1 o'clock in the morning. And he just dropped them off at my feet. And then he just moved away and just curled up and sat down and decided that there was no point in him babysitting because I was going to babysit. There was no point in both of us doing the same thing, right? That would just be redundant. So he thought if I was going to babysit, he could just take a nap. And there he just left me with the 4 of them. I'm sure the vixen wouldn't have been pleased if she knew that he did that. But I was so impressed with that amount of trust. Of course, I knew that he trusted me a lot because he was within, arm's length of me plenty of times, including the first time we were eye to eye. And that takes trust because I can reach out and strangle him. But he can also reach out and destroy my face with his claws if he wanted to when we were that close. So we trusted each other. But bringing those 4 kits down there and playing in the draw and with the weasel in the draw, dangerous at night, I was just astounded at that level of trust that he had in me, that he felt that close to me. And then I realized, it just immediately changed everything about how I felt about myself. I think the word is joy. I think what I felt when I came in that night was joy, and just astounding joy that this has happened to me, that this individual really feels this way about me. And then I thought, so much for academic writing, which I was working on. I have to tell his story. And then I decided I was going to tell his story. But you asked about the structure of it, and the structure was interesting because when I decided to tell his story, that was really all I was going to tell. And then, of course, I came from a background of academic writing. So I thought I would tell the true story of this fox. And that was easy enough. And telling things from his point of view was easy enough, too, because it's easy for me to see the world through his eyes and to empathize with him. Plus, my reading, I just love third person, a really tight third person. I'm a Hilary Mantel fan. So I was one of those people waiting and waiting and waiting for that third book to come out. And I just devoured it when it did. Yeah, I can't get enough of that style of writing. And so that was easy for me. But then I showed a section to a woman who I really trust a lot, who's a good writer. And she said, this is a memoir. And I didn't know it was a memoir because I just hadn't thought about it as a memoir. I thought about it as Fox's book. And then she explained that when you write a true story and you write in first person, because there were some sections, about me, there weren't many, but then it's a memoir. That's what you're writing. And so and I believed her right away because she's very, very smart and she knows a lot about literature. Then it took me a while. That was the slowest point of the book. And of course, I'm teaching all the while. I'm teaching at the university and working summers in Yellowstone Park, guiding for another university. I had to figure out how to make the story of the fox, the true story, the nonfiction book that would have been probably a little bit maybe too encyclopedic or some such. I had to make it into a memoir, and I had to figure out what that story was. And once I realized I was going to make it into a memoir, it took a while to gather up all the information. But the memoir story is it still has the same arc. There's still the beginning, middle, and an ending. The point that I wanted to make about the fox, the reason I was writing about him, not so much that it was a transgressive relationship, which it was, but it was a transformative relationship. That was almost more important for me that it was transformative than that it was odd and unusual. It transformed me. So from a person who just was so, I felt like I didn't have a home, like I didn't have a place. That was always my big opinion of myself, my identity. And I realized I had to make my own home, and I did. And I just gained a tremendous amount of self-esteem having him on my side. That just made a huge amount of difference. And I started copying him when I realized that he had a better life than I did. There was no reason that a fox should have a better life than I do. I mean, he had hobbies and things, and I just sat around worrying all day long and working. And he was very good at what he did, so he had free time left over. I suppose, I mean, not every fox can live that way, of course. That's why you can't have a relationship with every fox you see, because foxes that struggle or don't have a good habitat, they have to spend most of their time trying to make a living hunting. But he was a really good hunter, and he had lots of time left over every day. Plus, he wasn't nocturnal. I mean, he liked being out in the daytime. It's hard to make friends with an animal that wants to be nocturnal most of the time. So that was really important. He was a male, and male animals, and we know that pretty much from science, that male animals are more likely to take risks. And the females that have been around here have been afraid of me, because I think they're just more cautious, and females that go around hanging around with humans would probably doom the entire population, because most humans aren't like me. Most humans would think, I could sell that tail.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Oh, and then he wasn't bright red, so that helped too. I mean, he wasn't as valuable as some other foxes, I suppose. Made him a little bit more bold.
I want to go back to what you just said earlier, that it was a transgressive relationship, but also a transformative relationship. And then you said, an odd, uncommon relationship. Is there more to that transgression than just, I mean, yes, it is an odd and uncommon relationship. But are there other aspects of the relationship that make it transgressive? And what are those?
I think that it's really a taboo to be so close to a wild animal for much of society. I think that for some people, I mean, certainly Jane Goodall has been on everybody's radar for a long time, and she is wonderful. And anybody who does the kind of work and has the interest that I do, she's our hero, of course, in so many ways, but that's very unusual for most of us, especially those of us who work for the parks or for the academy. We can't just go around, and you're teaching students, you can't just go around with wild animals. And the wind is coming in. That's just really considered a big taboo. You're really expected to keep up that line, that gorge between humans and non-human animals. I think that's really what made it transgressive. So, and I mean, it's pets like dogs and horses, it's okay to imagine that they have personalities, but to imagine that a wild animal has a personality, that's not okay. And he wasn't a pet, of course, so we were two completely free living individuals. And what I was doing then was very odd, having a friendship with an animal that was free living. I didn't own it. I didn't feed it. I had no control over it. And people might think I was messing with nature or something to, take him out of his element and have him be friends with a human. But to him, I think I was just another animal who had these hands that were so I mean, certainly he could see how useful my hands were, and those big tools that I carried around that could stomp on a feral cat, but I don't stomp on feral cats, but I just dislike them. But I'm sure he found me very useful. But can you hear that wind?
Yeah.
Wow. So maybe the storm is coming. Well, that's good. It's going to cool down.
Is that through open or closed window, or is it through open windows or against closed windows?
No, I have the windows all open because otherwise it would be very hot. And I think we're going to get rain, and I think there's going to be a big storm. This can be a really windy valley. I'm sure we're getting some 30-mile-an-hour gusts right now. I mean, the trees are moving.
You've talked about imagining a personality for, I mean, again, my interaction with animals is with pets. And it's definitely the case that I believe that my pets they seem to have personalities on some level. I'm sure I'm imagining some way into it, but even with Fox, it seems like the personality is there in some way in terms of how Fox interacts with the world and also interacts with you, or the character of you. How much of that do you think is imagination, and how much of that do you think is observation in terms of kind of developing a sense of the personality of an animal?
I don't, of course, imagination is one of the themes of the book, and that's because I think that people lose their imaginations when they get older. And so much of the storyline in the book involves Saint X.
Yes.
You're going to have to, and I learned that from him. Beyond reading The Little Prince, I read Wind, Sand, and Stars. And he talks about that in Wind, Sand, and Stars too, how much he's tried to keep his youthful imagination, and how terrible it is when people get to a certain point in their life and they just cast off their imagination. Because once you have, he doesn't believe that you can ever gain it back again. So that it's definitely a theme. It crops up all the time. But his personality, I think that it's proper to say that I used intuition to discover his personality. And I think that you probably use the same when you're trying to figure out the personality of people. But I think it's easier with Fox because he didn't talk. And I think when people talk, they can really throw you off. You might key into what they're saying, but you want to forget about that, and you want to just watch what an individual does, not what they say. You can learn a lot from watching just an individual's eyes, especially an animal's eyes. I mean, Fox and I learned a lot from each other looking at our eyes. I'm sure in a group of animals in a meadow, they use that same technique, but they're watching what they do. They're not communicating with each other through language when they're different species. So I think that intuition is really important, and I think we do have it. I think our human nature allows us to intuit the personality of non-human animals. Neanderthals aren't the same species as Homo sapiens, and we not only communicated with them and understood them, but we mated with them and we reproduced. We had offspring with Neanderthals and also other species of the Homo genus. So I do think we have the ability to intuit the personality. I think that people have become too reliant on science and have forgotten that science is something that we need desperately to show us this bright light, but only on this very narrow, only on something very narrow. Science is going to get us to the moon, and we can't do it without science, but science isn't going to tell us whether we should go to the moon or whether we should worry about contaminating the moon. We have to have we can't just rely on science for everything. So we need to compartmentalize, but we're nowhere without science, but we need intuition too.
So you're saying that because Fox didn't talk, I mean, the other thing that occurs to me, and this may be me romanticizing the kind of presence of animals, right, is that Fox isn't trying to deceive. Fox is simply being who he is. Animals are, or at least my sense of them, or my hope is that they're not self-conscious in the way that we are. They're simply behaving in the way that they behave, and that carries a certain kind of authenticity to it. Although that could also be me as a human, just imposing that view upon them.
I agree that there's that authenticity when I think that language can be used in really complicating ways, and it can be very convoluting. Animals do things to trick us in a sense, but it's very simplistic. For example, when you're watching a plover and she's got little tricks and she's pretending like her wing is broken, and so that you'll chase her down and leave the babies alone. And Fox, I still think he was tricking me that day when the door knocked in the rain and he kept looking down the driveway. But I think it was him. I mean, thinking after I got to know him and realized how often he would come up to the door and push that rock against the door and make that noise, I realized that he had done that. But when I stared at him, he just looked down the driveway as though he was watching another animal that had fled down the driveway. But I couldn't find any other animal. So I do think that he was trying to trick me in a sense, not necessarily. It was just, yes, that's part of his personality. I mean, that was just part of his personality. He knew enough to do that, to give the impression that there was somebody else around.
That's right. And it's a fascinating moment. The book ends, or at the end, or the one of the big sort of drivers of the denouement of the book is wildfire or series of wildfires. And obviously we're in the midst of wildfire season throughout the West. You were just, before we came on, you were talking about, fire season in Montana. And I wonder if there's anything you want to talk about in terms of fire and wildfire and the changing ecology and the changing climate of the West and the effect of that on all animals, on human animals, but also animals like fox or the magpies or even the feral cats for that matter.
The changes are going to be enormous, and we have had such large areas of beetle kill in Washington and Oregon that I don't really think there's very many options other than to let the areas burn. Hopefully prescription burns can be affected so that they're slower and they're smaller and their management controlled so that we don't have what we have right now in Oregon. But it seems like until these forests burn down, we're going to have what we have in Oregon and Washington and Montana and Idaho, these enormous fires. It's going to make life entirely different for people. But I wish that we would do something in the short run so that things aren't quite so devastating just control where people are living. The more people we move into areas where there's wildlife and the less restrictions that we have. We have pretty tight restrictions in Montana. We have had for about a month now. People can't even run chainsaws in the middle of the day. It's pretty tightly controlled. We had no fireworks, things like that. Right. But we're still not controlling where people can live. And there's still a tremendous amount of traffic, which means that there's always the cigarette butts that can come out the windows of the car. And all of those things make it more dangerous for wildlife, because when there's a fire, the firefighters concentrate on humans and domestic animals. And that's all that they concentrate on. They just don't have time, and they're not watching for who's going to save the elk and the foxes, and so it's devastating for them. And one of the things that I've noticed listening to the reports on fire, people forget that on a south-facing slope in the Rockies, in the northern Rockies, once you burn it off, it's not coming back. Not in our lifetime. That's been the case for decades now. Even before we talked about climate change, that was the case. So as we're losing the trees on these south-facing slopes, nothing's going to come back. There's simply too much runoff. I mean, they don't hold any water because they're slopes. Mm-hmm. And they're south-facing, so they're hot. We don't have any species of trees anymore that can colonize a south-facing slope in the Rockies. So the habitat is really changing a lot. Animals like black bears that need trees are going to be at a big loss. It's going to be a big change for wildlife.
I think let's on that note, let's turn it over to some questions from the audience. I've got a couple questions here in the Q&A. This is actually not a question, and this person wants to remain anonymous. But they write, I very much appreciate your combined clinical and emotional reporting. I feel very included in your experiences. I bet that makes you happy. I love this book, and thank you for investing so much of yourself in my behalf so I might be present for the adventure vicariously. That does kind of create or provoke a question for me. And the question is, as I recall, the first time we spoke, you talked about your discomfort with the personal writing, with the kind of first person as a voice, that you're much more comfortable writing in the third person. And so I'm curious about sort of how you I don't want to say overcame that, but how you kind of worked with that in terms of creating this. I mean, you know, as you said earlier, it is a memoir, and memoir is a whatever else a memoir is, it's a first person piece of nonfiction. So I'm curious about how you accommodated the first person.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you, I don't know if you're a bookseller, but you might know books. Do you know Julian Barnes' Sense of an Ending? If you're writing a memoir and you want to be very terse, but you still need to write in first person, and you know that was a Man Booker Award winning book, and he's a British author, Julian Barnes, Sense of an Ending. It's first person, it's fiction, but it's a fictional memoir, and it's his wisdom about what a memoir is and what it can do and what memory is just outrageously appropriate. It's wonderful, but he's so terse. And so as you're going through Julian Barnes' book, you can see how the narrator, the first person narrator, manages to never intrude into the action, tries to stay out of the action as much as possible, and keeps the first person sections active, and then just really small sections where you're seeing what he's thinking in a sentence or two, but he keeps it very, very terse. I'm not a master like Julian Barnes. I think he's written 1 million books or something, but that's definitely the person who that's the book that I relied on over and over again to go back to see how you write in first person without oversharing and just intruding into the action of the book. I didn't want to mess up the scenes. I really like my book, not because I don't like first person, but because I love scenes. I like to go from scene to scene to scene because I'm a very visual writer. So I have to see things. And that, being a visual writer, keeps me from pontificating. And that really helps. I mean, I have to see a scene, and I think Julian Barnes's book is very similar. It's scenic.
It's interesting that you say that, because I often think, and sometimes say to students, that, you know, in a first person piece of nonfiction, you want to use that first person, you want to use that word I as little as possible, not as
Yes,
much, to really maximize its impact and its effect. We have one other question. When you field classes in Yellowstone, what is the most surprising thing to your students?
I think the thing that surprises me that every single student always says is, why is it so quiet here? Everyone says that. I just want to say, what, do you just live next to a subway station or what? I mean, how do they think it's quiet? Everybody says that. It's so quiet. To me, it's so loud. And furthermore, they will extrapolate and say, I mean, there's just not hardly any birds. And I just feel like the birds are just screaming all the time. The birds they do just have one clutch here. And I think if you come from a more moderate climate, California or the Southeast, or well, every place is more moderate than 9,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains on the Canadian border. So I guess if you come from anywhere else, birds might double clutch. And so I can see how there might be more noise. And I guess birds in the tropical areas of the warmer areas are probably making more noise, but because they just clutch once. So now here, they came in maybe March, a little bit in April, they've nested, they've given birth. The little ones are squawking right now, but they're almost grown, and that's it. They will not have any more young this year. So most of the noise that birds make is probably mating noise, and then fighting, yelling, warning me and the deer and such off when we get too close to the nests when there's babies in it. After that, there's really not much of a point for them to be making a lot of noise. So people always say, it's so quiet, and why aren't there any birds here?
Yeah, I mean, but I'm curious, like, in addition to the birds, what you're hearing when people say it's quiet and you're hearing all that noise, what are the other, what are, as a city person myself, what are the other noises that you're hearing?
Well, when I'm in Yellowstone, you can hear a Harley everywhere. Right. In that park. You can go into the back country. I'm not guessing. I've done this. It was one of my seasonal jobs there. So I know that there are places in the backcountry where you stop hearing the sound of Harleys, and it goes a long way. I mean, it's copyrighted or whatever, right? That noise that that the bikes make. So you get to a certain point beyond where Harleys can't make noise anymore, and then the browsings. I mean, there's a browse line there. That's just unbelievable. Animals also know where the noise stops, and that's where they feel comfortable staying and feeding. But other people just don't even notice it. And it's big Harley country because, of course, most of the year, you can't ride on ice and snow. So when the weather's nice, and it's really beautiful to be on a bike in the park, so a lot of people avail themselves of that. So you hear the Harleys, you hear all the traffic, and the human beings people just make a lot of noise.
Yeah, we're a noisy crew. I agree. We got a couple of other questions. Here's the first one is, I'm mentoring a university student with an interest in animal behavior. Her focus is on the side of the softer sciences like psychology, but do you have any advice on courses of further study for such a student?
Well, and by the way, biology is kind of considered a soft science too. I mean, the chemists and the physicists definitely, they think that it's a soft science. It's based on evolution. So hard sciences consider us to be soft also. So biology is really important. Behavior is based on physiology to some extent, not entirely. It's nature and nurture, but you should, not having an understanding of genetics and how genes are transmitted and the role that they play, I think that leaves you at a really big loss. You probably didn't want that answer, but I really think that biochemistry, which is where you learn about genetics and the transmission of genes and traits, that's really important. Your students already going to want to be gravitating towards the social sciences, but you need to compare nature and nurture both. And so really the biochemistry, understanding the genetics is really, I think, important to understand behavior.
Okay. And then here's another question. You have such a beautiful and unusual life, which you seem to love. Do you anticipate that being published will change your life in positive ways, negative ways? How has it changed your life?
Well, it just started, but I don't think I'll be moving, mostly because everything's getting crowded everywhere. If I moved, it would only be to go someplace wilder, but we're kind of running out of those places. I suspect I will keep writing. I think that's the biggest difference, is that now I would like to do more writing. I've been working on a novel and I want to be able to spend more time doing that. I have spent decades just working so many different jobs. And David, because you're a professor, so you can vouch for the fact that we're not really super well paid. It's not like professors retire at the age of 55 because we, yeah, right. People always wonder why professors work until they drop dead. Yes, we love it, but we work till we drop dead because we can't afford to retire before then. And so there's professoring. It takes a lot of time. And then on every one of my days of vacation, I was guiding pretty much in the park. And professoring isn't a 40-hour-a-week job. It's not an hourly job. Your students come first and second and third. And if they need you on a Sunday, you're there. And it's not because you have to be, but it's because you truly, truly love your students. And you just do. They're just amazing. They're paying for your time and they're the future. So they take up a tremendous amount of time, and I want to start to find a little bit more time, blocks of time when I can write. I'm hoping if anything comes from this, I don't expect my life's going to change much in the next couple of years, but I hope eventually I'll be doing more writing.
Great. Let me ask you one last question, just apropos of your answer to that. You're saying that, you could see yourself potentially, if you're going to moving to someplace wilder, although there aren't that many places, that the wildness, there's less wildness or availability of wildness than there was. And I'm just curious, for you as someone who, is a naturalist and a scientist and someone who has lived in kind of the edge of the wild, what do you think the effect for humanity? I mean, not to make it like a broad philosophical question, but what is the effect for us of the kind of contraction of the wild, or the dismantling of wild spaces? What's the effect on people?
I really think that it's going to be hard for people who are naturally country people. I don't think people have much of a choice where they live. I think that there are some people that absolutely have to. I think there's a line in the book where I'm talking to someone who comes to help plow the road, and I asked him if he's going to move to the town, and he said he'd rather slit his throat. And that a lot of people, I mean, they just can't possibly live in a more crowded place, and yet the virus has spread people out so far, and without any planning, there's just houses everywhere now, and many of them nobody seems to have moved into. I'm not really sure what's happening, but it still takes up that space. And then when people to build those houses, there's all the noise and the cars, and it's putting animals out of its spot. So you asked what it has to do with people, and what it has to do with people is that those of us that need a lot of space around are going to be there's just going to be massive amounts of stress. I think that people are really going to have problems if we don't try to plan a little bit more so that everybody has space around them. I also think we need to make it so that even everyone, no matter where they live, because how can you know when somebody's a child what they like? And I think that all children should really have access to wild open spaces. So I think there should be some planning so that everybody has access to open areas. That there's a lot of people I know, but here comes Jamie. So
Yes, well, thank you
you.
so much, Catherine. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I'm so pleased to have been able to be here with you, Jamie.
Oh, I just want to thank you both. That was Catherine Raven in conversation with David Ulin, and it was a fascinating conversation. Receiving so many comments to me personally, thanking us for having you both tonight, and for all the questions about the recording. Yes, it's being recorded. You will all be getting an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and everything I shared in the chat box tonight. So I hope to see you both in the near future, hopefully in person, but
Yeah.
Best of wishes. And Catherine, want to take us out?
Well, I want to say thank you to David, mostly for your time and for your intelligence. And it was your questions and your commentary is fascinating. So I am hoping that people will read your books, and your students are very lucky. That's what I want to say.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I feel the same about you. So as I said, I was delighted to have a chance to talk to you again about the book.
Thank you.
It's great. Good night.
Good night.
Night, everybody.